All right, let's go ahead and get the ball rolling. My name is Chris Granger. I'm a program manager here with the Visual Studio Platform team. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit today about the new editor, its extensibility model, and quite frankly, why you should care about it, right? So let's take a look at this picture here. We have the 2008 editor, right? Now, a lot of people have come to call the new editor the WPF editor. And that concerns me a little bit for one reason, because it suggests to an extent that maybe all we did was take this picture and make it a little bit prettier, that our work on the editor was a visual refresh, if you will. And I'm here to dispel that right off the bat. Our work with the editor was not simply just a facelift. It was to integrate a bunch of newer technologies, to update our APIs so that you have the ability to actually go in and add functionality that you could never do before, right? And so we've done these things. We've created a new managed API that enables you to have a lot of power, but at the same time is nice and simple so that you guys can go out and create great things. On top of that, what we wanted to do was integrate some of Microsoft's newer technologies, things like the Managed Extensibility Framework, right, which we call MEF, which enables us to get extensions inside of Visual Studio much more easily than before. And then there certainly is the Windows Presentation Foundation, WPF, right? And that did help us update the visual appeal of the editor a little bit. But our main goal with that was to enable you guys to add visual elements inside of the editor in ways you couldn't do before. So it's not about refresh, it's about giving you guys the keys to do great things. But as anyone can tell you, it's the combination of all of these aspects together that really brings out what the editor is capable of doing. And so if you haven't seen it before, this is what the new editor looks like. And you're actually seeing in this, this picture here an internal prototype that we built to show exactly how far you could take some of this functionality. And what you're seeing happening is real-time inline diffing. So as I'm typing here, it is showing me the changes I've made in my file above the lines that I've made them in. Now, what's really kind of interesting and goes to show how far you really can take this, these thumbnails that you see down here are actually themselves miniature editors. So as I start typing in that top main window, you'd see those thumbnails going along with me. Now, the important part about this picture, and the reason I show it, is not the functionality I just described. It's the fact that that was an extension. The fact that you, out here in the audience, anyone in here, could go and create functionality just like that without ever having to call me up, without ever having to come to the Visual Studio team and say, guys, I need you guys to make some code changes here for me so that you can make this work. Right now, with Beta 2, you can create something like that. But one of the things I get when I try and go explain to people, hey, we have this really great extensible editor, right, is they come back to me and say, why would I even want to extend the editor? It's just text. But we've come a little way since the 1980s with Notepad, right? We've gotten better than just text. Instead of that, we're an entire subset of things. In this case, we do have something that is the text, right? It's in a data structure called the text buffer. But on top of that, we have another layer that enables us to create logic on top of it. So if I wanted to parse something and provide that information out to other people, you have the ability to do things like that. But you also have the ability to go ahead and present UI to us. You have control over how we display things in ways that you don't in other programs. And what that does is it enables us to do something like this, right? So you can imagine, sure, the text layer is all of this text that you see here. That's the text buffer underneath there. And that's what you had access to in other extensible editors. But now you have access to the logic, which is stuff like this syntax highlighting you see here, right? That's what is enabled by that. And then the UI. These green bubbles that you see here, they have nothing to do with the file itself. It's grabbing information from some other location, some other source, and creating visuals inside of the editor. Now, this is cool, but you can take it a lot further than that. What you see here is another picture where we've dropped an image into the editor right there so that you have an example of the UI you're trying to create. Or, taken to the extreme, you have a whole interface created inside of the editor. This one happens to be a dashboard that integrates with Twitter, grabs information and lets you know how you're doing when you're up there presenting to other people like I am right now. So you have all of this power ready for you to use. Now, that being said, it's not very useful if it's really complicated to do this. If it takes you 3 years to write this, what's the point, right? And so one of the big tenets for us was we need to make this easy. And so one of the things I hope you take away from my talk today is the fact that anybody can do this. Any one of you guys right now could go and create things like this. And so I'm going to try and prove that to you today. So let's pick a scenario. Let's take a look at something that we're trying to do, some common thing that we might want to do, right? And I'm sure all of you guys have seen code like this somewhere in your code base. You're trying to get something to work. You know it's the wrong way to do it, and you want to come back and get to it later, right? It'd be nice if there was a nice, easy way to say, find this in my file, right? Something that enables me to, as I go down through, see it really quickly. Well, the simplest thing you could think of probably is, hey, let me syntax highlight it. Let me give it an orange background. That means as I go down through the file, I can understand it nice and simply. But in order to do this, we need to understand a little bit about how the editor handles text. So remember I said, if you remember this diagram, I said we do have this data structure that holds all of our text. It's called a text buffer, right? But as many of you guys know, if you've ever tried to work with text that comes out of a buffer directly, you have a problem. And that problem is I can start typing after you've started trying to process information on it, right? And so ways we used to go about trying to solve these concurrency issues was locking buffers so that you didn't have to worry about people trying to type, or keeping a bunch of copies of the information. We didn't like those. We thought there was a better way to go about this. And so we created a concept called snapshotting. Now, this is really important because what snapshots enable for you is to look at basically a picture of the buffer at a certain point in time. It is essentially doing all of the work of making sure that you have the information you expect in a stable form. They're completely immutable. Okay? So that sort of solves this issue of needing to worry about, oh, someone is typing. But at the same time, a lot of what you're trying to do when you're going through information in the buffer, right, in this case in snapshots, you really want, or rather are really concerned with substrings of that text. You're never really wanting to reference the whole thing all at once. You want those substrings. But the problem with carrying around a bunch of substrings is that you're carrying around a bunch of duplicate information. Now, since these snapshots are immutable, we don't need substrings anymore, right? That text is always going to be there for us to reference if we need to. So realistically, what we want to be able to do to be efficient about this is be able to reference a range within our snapshot. And that's a bit of a conceptual difference, right? We're not carrying around actual text anymore. All we're doing is carrying around ranges. But at the same time, it's a very powerful concept, and it's very, very efficient, like I said before. And so you can imagine, in the example that we had here, right, what we want to be able to do is take a look at this span of text, which is what we call a range, right? And that is nothing more than a start location and a length, because we can always go back to the snapshot and say, hey, what text exists in this range, right? So it's nice and simple in that respect. So there are only 3 big things you really have to understand to be able to walk away and work with text inside of the editor today. And that's this notion that there is a text container, right? This text buffer, which is handling all of the insertions and deletions and stuff for us. Then we have these snapshots that we can grab from the text buffer, which enables us to have a solid base to work on, something stable that we know isn't going to change on us. And then this notion of being able to reference ranges within that snapshot, and this is called a span. So what we really want to be able to do in this case, right, is to get our information, is to understand where this word exists inside of our snapshot. And we want to be able to then label it as a to-do, right? That's the most fundamental thing we need to be able to do is say, this word has meaning to us, right? In this case, this span has meaning to us. Let's find a way to label it. So you could say we're trying to find them, right? Simple enough. That's what we're trying to do. Well, we have a mechanism for this. It's called tagging. And it does exactly what I just described. It takes a look at text, goes through it, parses it to figure out exactly what span you're interested in, and then labels it with something. So if we think about a line of code like this, right? And we try to understand exactly what labels might you think would exist on this. So what tags might exist on this line? We look at it like this. Well, if is a keyword, right? You could think of x, y, and z as being variables. And then what we want to be able to do is write a tagger that handles creating a label for to do for us. So let's see how this is done in some code here. Switch over to Visual Studio. So in tagging, there's a thing called a tagger, and this is what does all of the work for you. This is what goes through the text and labels it. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and implement one of these for us. Now you can see up here at the top, I have a thing called a to-do tag, right? So this is our label. And you can see it implements something called a glyph tag, and we'll worry about why it does that later. But for all intents and purposes, you can think of this as basically just an empty interface that you have the ability to then add information to. And so the only method really that you have to worry about as a tagger, we wanted to keep this simple, right, is this thing called get tags. And you can see it's given basically a collection of spans. The normalized here is not necessarily so important, but it's given a collection of spans. And what you're going to do is take a look at each of those spans, right, and find out if there's a to-do in it in our case. And so the first thing we need to do is go ahead and iterate through these, right? Oops. So we're going to get our cursed span out of this. And like I said, what we're trying to do is find these to-dos. So what we need to do is be able to get the text from our span to find out if there's a to-do in it. And remember I said that spans do not carry text around with themselves. What they do is they reference a range in a snapshot. And so when we call getText, it's grabbing that information based on the snapshot. And now we're just working with a string. So we're going to lowercase it to make it so we don't have to worry about casing. And then we will check to see if our search text is in it. In this case, just the word to do, right? And we'll assign this to a variable here. All right, so we know whether or not this is there, and we're just going to say, all right, if we have a to do in this file, so there's an index for it. Now, the thing is, what we get back in this collection of spans, we don't necessarily know what those spans are. It could be the whole file. It could potentially be this line. It could be anything, right? It could be this line. But what we want to do is label just the word to do. And so what we need to do is isolate out a span that represents just that word. So that's the next thing we're going to do. And you can see we're creating something called a snapshot span, right? So it's just a span associated directly to a specific snapshot. And this will be our to-do span. And we can see what it's expecting is a snapshot. And since we're working on spans, we already know that we can just use theirs, because that's what we're working off of. And then it's looking for a new range, a new span. And that, like I said before, is just a start and a length. And so it's going to be the start of our current span, plus the location, plus the index of the word to do. And then it's just the length of that word. So now we've isolated out our to-do span, right? So we've isolated out this word from whatever we were given. And what we do then is return back, something called a tag span. Now, a tag span is basically a tuple. It's nothing more than the combination of a span and a tag. In this case, it's for our to-do tag, right? So we have our own tag type, our own label. And so we just say we want to associate this tag, a new to-do tag, to our to-do span. Close all of this up here. And so with that, we've done all that was necessary to go ahead and find our to-dos and label them as to-dos. But the problem with this is, while we have some data, we don't have any visualization for it. We don't have anything that we can see. So if I ran that, we wouldn't actually see anything happen. We could debug it, right, and step through and see that, yes, things are actually executing. We have no way to immediately see this is working. So one of the things I thought we might do is be able to create basically an icon for it that would sit in what we used to call the gutter in 2008, right? Well, the gutter is now actually a series of extensions called margins. And these are things that you, as extenders, can actually create yourself. Now, this one that holds the breakpoint in it, right, that's called the glyph margin. It holds glyphs or icons for different things inside of the file. This one next to that is the change tracking margin, right? That's something we remember from 2008. And then, again, next to that is even the outlining margin. Outlining is actually done as a margin as well. And so what I want to do, right, to make it real simple to see a visualization right off the bat that our tagger is actually working, is create a glyph, basically, for to-dos, a marker for it. And so it might look a little something like this. So let's make it happen. So we go back to our file here, and we open up something called a glyph factory. And you can see here it has a single method, right, this generate glyph method, and it's looking back for a UI element. Now, for those of you guys who have never worked with the Windows Presentation Foundation before, UI element is sort of this general interface that everything in WPF relates back to. And so what we actually need to be able to do here is go ahead and create a WPF class, that represents our icon. So you can see I brought up the add file here, and we're going to create a to-do glyph. And again, for those of you who haven't messed with WPF before, WPF is typically written in a language called XAML, which is this XML-based language. Which is an XML-based language. Oh, it's getting mad at me. That makes it nice and simple to go ahead and write interface elements pretty quickly. Wait for this for a second to come up here. All right. And so remember, the picture basically was just a circle. So what we're going to do is create an ellipse. And you can see, again, this is all just an XML-based language, so it's all based on properties here. And we'll make it orange. Simple enough. And we'll give it a stroke of, so that's the outline of orange-red. So we can denote the difference there. And we need to give it a width. Make it 12, seems like a good number. And we need to give it a stroke thickness. All right, so with this, we have a nice little image here that we can go ahead and drop in. And all we have to do then for our glyph factory is return a new to-do glyph. So this is, again, showing we really are using WPF all over the place, and you have the ability to leverage that yourself. So let's build this and actually see something work, right? We wrote this code, but we haven't seen anything work yet. So let's run this, see what happens. Open up this file here, this project. And you can see right over here in the glyph margin, right, we now have our to-do glyphs right in there, those WPF elements that we created on any line that has a to-do. So with that little tiny bit of code, we've already got a visualization of our data in there. But if I were out there in the audience right now, the thing I would be wondering is, yeah, we wrote some classes, but how in the world did Visual Studio know to use our classes? How did we get inside of Visual Studio? We never talked about that, right? And so the question is, how did the editor load us? Well, remember I mentioned at the very beginning that we integrated with a technology called the Managed Extensibility Framework, or MEF, right? And it's what handles all of this interaction of trying to get extensions inside of Visual Studio. Now, in an implementation standpoint, MEF is pretty easy to write. It's pretty easy in implementation. But conceptually, it's a little difficult. It takes a little while to wrap your head around it. So there are 2 points that I want you to take away about MEF. And if you understand these 2 things, in general, you'll be able to work with MEF inside of the editor. And that is the notion of, if you export something, you're giving something to Visual Studio. If you import something, you're taking something from Visual Studio. So in our case, right, we export we were giving to Visual Studio a tagger. So we were exporting out a tagger to some repository of components. And then Visual Studio goes, you know what? I'm looking at this file. I want all of the taggers. And so it asks that same repository of components to import all of the taggers from it. Now, what's interesting is that the reverse also happens. You, as an extension writer, might need a service from Visual Studio. And in order for you to do that, what you can do is say, import whatever service you want, and Visual Studio will have exported it out for you. So let's take a look again at the code that made sort of us get inside of Visual Studio. And let's see here, we'll close this out. We don't need that anymore. All right, let's take a look at what we call the provider. So you can see MEF uses metadata attributes, right? Attributes on top of classes. So you might be familiar with this, like if you want to make something serializable, right? You would use an attribute on top of it. And so we have an attribute here called export, and this is something that's generic to MEF. And what we're doing is we're exporting out an iTagger provider. Now, this provider implementation pattern is very common. It's throughout all of our APIs. It's this notion that you export out something that gives us what we're actually looking for. And so you can expect to see that all throughout this. But there's another notion that's really important for editor extensibility, and that's this idea of content type. So you can think, I wrote this tagger for Visual Basic, right? And the editor goes and tries to load all of the taggers, but I'm working on a C# file. It doesn't make any sense for my editor to be loading a VB tagger, right, for a C# file. And so what content type enables us to do is it's a metadata that allows us to basically tell the editor when our extension should be loaded. Now, while content type is technically a graph, it's useful to think about it a little bit as a hierarchy. So you can think above code, which is the content type we're using here, might be something like text, right? So just for a text file. But code is a more specific kind of text. And then even more specific than that might be C#, right? Or basic for Visual Basic. And so it's this way of us basically attaching ourselves to a type of content that that prevents us from being loaded in all situations, only the ones we want to be. There's also another bit of metadata, and this one's specific to taggers, right? This tag type, right? So what we're telling the editor is basically our tagger is going to provide this kind of tag. In this case, it's a to-do tag. So that's the kind of code that you're going to be working with when you deal with MEF. And let's take another look just a second at the glyph factory, because it's a little bit more complicated in terms of the MEF attributes it has. But at the same time, it's never anything more than doing something like this, either exporting or importing using these attributes. And so you can see we have the export here, and this time we're exporting out an iGlyph factory provider, right? You can see we also are able to name this. Now, the reason why that might be important is because of the next attribute. So we need to be able to name it so that we can then order these things. Now, ordering for Glyph Factory is talking about z-index order within the margin. So you could imagine if I put a breakpoint over here, right, and we have a to-do on that same line, you don't want the breakpoint to be obscured by your to-do. You would actually want your to-do to be underneath it. And so by ordering ourselves before a VS text marker, which is what the glyph that is created for to-dos, we're making sure that we show up underneath breakpoints and we're not obscuring functionality. Then you can see we're also exporting out to a content type of code. And it just so happens that glyph factories are tightly coupled with tags, right? And so you have the ability to go ahead and say, well, I want this glyph to show up for any place that has this tag. And that's why our code was nice and simple. So that's kind of how MEF works for us. But there's one point, and if there's only one thing you take away from my talk today, I hope it is this point. It is the notion of using taggers, right? It's this notion of supplying data out to people. Now, this is incredibly powerful. And the reason is anyone can now go, right? If they have your tagger installed on the machine, anyone can now go and use your tags. They can consume your data to add functionality. So we saw one example of this, right, where we created this glyph factory. We created a glyph for it. But our original example was to syntax highlight our line, right? To syntax highlight this to do. Well, now someone else with our tagger could go and create the extension that does this. Because they have that data, the hard work is already done for them. Now it's a matter of building out functionality on top of it, right? And so all they have to do is consume tags to make this happen. Syntax highlighting, however, in the editor has kind of a different name. We call it classification. Now, realistically, it's basically a specialized form of tagging, right? So we said before, tagging is taking a span and giving it a label. When you think about syntax highlighting, that's essentially all you're doing. You're saying this span of text is a keyword, and that keyword has special meaning. It maps down to a color table, right, and provides the coloring information we would need. Classification is just the formalization of that. And so if we think about this line that we saw before again, right, and we go ahead and apply the same thing that we did before, where instead of looking at looking at potential tags, we think about the classifications that might exist. So instead of X, Y, and Z being variable, right, X, Y, and Z might be user type, which is a coloring group for us. And then this to do at the end would be a comment. All right. So I'm done talking about that. Let's actually do something with it, right? Let's see this work. And so the main thing we're looking at here, remember I said we were working with something called classification. So the main thing we're trying to do is build a classifier. Now the first thing I want to point out to you is, remember I said, well, what we're going to try and do is consume tags, right? And in order to consume tags within the editor, what you do is you use something called a tag aggregator. Now, if you remember back to my MEF statement, I said you can import things from Visual Studio. And I want to show you how we got that tag aggregator. So you look at this line right here. You can see we're using an attribute, the import attribute, and we're importing something called an iBuffer tag aggregator factory service, right? And this is what is enabling us to grab a service from Visual Studio and then use it down here like you would any other class, any other object, right? And we could use this thing called create tagger, and that gives us our to-do tagger aggregator that enables us to consume our tags. And so since all we need to do, basically, is consume these tags and put them back out as classifications, this will be a relatively simple thing to do. What we're going to do is go ahead and get our tags. Oh, excuse me, I jumped a little ahead of myself here. Like a tagger, remember there's a get tags method. A classifier has a get classifications method. Very similar. You're given a span instead of a collection of spans. And you're returning back a list of these things called classification spans. And we'll see exactly what makes a classification span special in a second. So we need to get our tags, right? And we have this aggregator, and we need to get tags from it, right? And you can see what it's asking for is a snapshot of some sort, a snapshot or a span. We have a span given to us already. So we want to get the tags for our current span. And then we're going to iterate through them. Now, remember when we returned back our tags, we returned back something called a tag span, right? But when we get tags from our aggregator, what we actually get back is something called an iMapping tag span. And the reason we do that is because there can be very complicated situations where you might actually have multiple buffers underlying everything, right? So you could imagine in ASP.NET where you have embedded C# inside of HTML, right? Those are actually in different buffers. And so we need to be able to map to make sure we get to the right place. And so that's why we need to do what you're about to see now. We need to get back the span that represents our to-do from the tag, right? So we'll call this to-do span. Oops. Yeah, call this to-do span. And you can see our tag span has a member called span, but because it's an iMapping span, we need to be able to get regular snapshot spans out of it. And so you can see there are different ways you can map this down. The one we're going to use is the snapshot, right? Because that's what we have right now with from our span that was originally passed into us. And so we're going to map that to the right context. forgot. So when you do this, there's a potential that it could come back as all sorts of different things in really complicated situations. And so you're given back a list of spans. In our case, since we're dealing with a simple one, all we ever need is the first. And with that, all we have to then do is add a new classification span to our list. And so you can see here, we're going to make a classification span. It's looking for a span and something called a classification type. So remember how when we were looking at that diagram and we saw it broken down into keyword, user type, and comment? Those are what we call classification types. And basically, they reference a coloring group inside of the editor. And so we have our to-do span that we want to have colored, right? And you can see I passed in our to-do type in the constructor. So we just need to use that then. All right. And with that, we'll build it. And presuming I didn't screw anything up, we should actually see that we now have syntax highlighting for our to-dos. So open that file back up, all right? And there you go. Now we have our to-dos highlighted orange. Now to prove that this is actually working, there's nothing happening in the background here, right? So I'm able to start typing, and you can see both the glyph and the syntax coloring happened for you. Now think about this just for a second. We wrote very, very small amounts of code, but we got this functionality in there pretty easily, right? But honestly, this is just the start of things. So because we have this data out, you can imagine all sorts of applications somebody could go and create that use that tag, use those to-do tags. So you can imagine somebody actually creating something that replaces lines with to-do with a picture of a clipboard, some WPF element with a clipboard. Or even maybe you have something that integrates with TFS and you use work items to track to-do sorts of things. You could create something that when you click on it brings up TFS. So you have, because you have this data, you have the ability to add all sorts of functionality on top of it. And one of the things I want to do is show you some examples of exactly how far you can theoretically take some of this editor extension stuff, right? So I showed you some pictures. Let's see something work, because that's a lot more interesting. Now remember one of the pictures I showed you had an image dropped inside of the editor, inside of the code? I have that extension running. And so you can see I have this, this picture of the UI that I may want to build, right? And I can go ahead and just drag it in there and drop it. Because this is a WPF element, right, it's more than just an image, I have interactivity here. And so you can see I'm able to resize it. I can move it around if I wanted to. So if I don't like it in that location, I can go down here. And you can see it's reserving space for itself. Now, this is pretty interesting and complex functionality, right? But the application there is maybe not as great as you might want. So let's imagine I don't really like the completion presenter UI, like the UI that comes up when I start completing things, right? And so I have another extension that replaced it. And so this is an example of something you can do. This one's actually pretty easy. The complex functionality is actually you writing all the WPF that makes the image, right? But you can see I have this extra functionality. It's showing me the descriptions of all of my completions here in line. And it's showing me just in a different way. Now, for those of you guys who are really code-focused, hardcore coding, this probably might not be interesting to you because these are a bunch of UI things. But how about something that's a little bit more data-focused, something like spell checking as I type my comments out, for example, right? That requires a lot of back-end processing. So you can see as I'm typing things, it's underlying it, it's telling me that it's not right, and I have the ability to get potential corrections for it. So that one it can't figure out, but, oops, excuse me. But if I try right, which is a common one, you can see I get all of these through a smart tag, and I'm able to go ahead and replace them just like that. So there's all sorts of functionality that you can do here. There's all sorts of things that you could potentially create. And we're just starting with it, really. It's just the surface, just nicking the surface. But my hope, right, is that by nicking the surface, that you've got some ideas. right? That you've gotten excited about what could happen, what you could create. And when you think about all the things we've learned, we've actually gone through the whole process of creating an editor extension. So let's talk a little bit about that again and make sure that we have all of these points, right? We learned how to interact with text. That was the very first thing we talked about. We learned about this notion that there are these three things that you really need to be worried about. This text buffer, which is the container that holds all of the text inside of it. There's a snapshot, right, which is helping us get over our need to deal with concurrency issues. It's helping us to be able to reference a stable copy of this stuff, of the text that we want to work on. And then we have this thing called a span, which enables us to reference ranges of text within inside of the snapshot. We then learned how to provide data on top of all of this information. We learned how to tag spans, right? That tagging was, you can think of it, in this case, I use the analogy of a basset hound. It's going through all of our information and getting us the things we worry about, right? And that it's a relatively simple interface. You're writing this get tags method that looks at spans and returns back the tags associated to them. We then learned that because we can provide data out to people, that there are all sorts of ways that we could potentially consume these tags. We learned about being able to syntax highlight, right? Be able to create an orange background on these things. To then also create glyphs for them. And how you use these things called tag aggregators to do that. One of the last things we learned was how to export MEF components, right? We learned how the editor utilizes the managed extensibility framework to get extensions inside of Visual Studio, and that there were two important things along with that you really, really needed to understand. There was this notion of exporting things out to Visual Studio, and that Visual Studio would then import them. And there's also this notion of being able to import services from Visual Studio so that you can use them in your extensions. But there's a lot more going on here. There's, again, I keep stressing this, that we're just nicking the surface. And so to learn a little bit more, you can check out our blog. We'll be working to get a bunch more stuff up there and hopefully get some more examples out to you guys. Now, all of the code, all of the things I showed you today, by the way, the examples that I showed you, they're all samples. They're all things that you can go get the code and see. And they will be posted. Most of them already are posted, but a couple of them will come a little bit later in the week. So in general, I just want to say again, my name is Chris Granger. I am going to be pretty much your contact for editor extensibility, right? And so if you have questions, please get a hold of me, and we'll talk some things out. Also, towards the end of the session, actually, I have two things to announce here. So there's a session right after mine that talks about the mechanism that we use for deployment and installation of all of these extensions called VSX files. And we have one of our program managers, Quanto, will be up here explaining how all of that works to you. And it's very good information, so please stay for that. The other thing is I also have another talk tomorrow. So this one was a pretty general sort of surface talk about bringing you up to speed on the basics. The one tomorrow is going to go a little bit more in depth and talk about how to integrate languages inside of Visual Studio. And so with that, I open it up to the floor. Does anyone have any questions?
One of the problems with the snapshot is if somebody is typing concurrently into the text buffer, at the end of your processes, what you would like to know is whether or not the span that you're using, whether that has been changed in the other thread. Is that capability in there?
So the question he asked is, let's imagine that you're working on some snapshot, right? You're working with spans, and you've located the span, but at the same time, someone else was typing, right? And so that span might have changed, and you want to be able to see what that span would look like in that second snapshot, right?
Well,
that ending snapshot. I see. So we have something called tracking spans. And what this enables you to do is you create a span associated to a specific snapshot, and you say, or excuse me, you create a tracking span specific to a certain snapshot. And what you're then able to do with that is say, well, okay, I have some changes. I have a new snapshot. I want to see what that is. If that still exists, first off, right, if that span is still relevant to me, in that new snapshot? And then if it is, what does that span look like? And so you can get that span by using this tracking span notion. And you have control over how it deals with edges. So for example, if I started typing inside of my to-do, right, and I put a bunch of O's in there, how that tracking span would handle that is up to you. So you have the notion of including edges or excluding edges and stuff like that.
And can it tell you, because obviously your span location is going to change between the two if text has been added, even outside the range that you care about.
Mm-hmm.
Does the tracking span allow you to take that into account or figure out how to translate between the spans you've been using and the corresponding span in the new thing?
So your question,
question.
Yeah, it is. So let me make sure I understand your question. Your question is, basically, can you very specifically tell whether or not to dismiss your old span, right? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
If I've just done if my code has done something to a particular span, and meanwhile somebody's been typing above me in the text, then the spans that I've used are now changed between the two snapshots that presumably I have access to.
Right.
I assume I can access multiple snapshots.
Yep.
Is there any easy way to...
Basically find out where you would be?
Yeah.
So that's what the tracking span is actually handling for you. So when you start typing all over the place, let's say like the scenario you gave, I start typing above, right? And that would move my span down. What the tracking span is doing, okay, this text used to be here, this span used to be here, but it's actually here now. And so when you tell it to give you the new span, it's going to give you that same text, right? Presuming that it didn't change any, but it's going to be that new range, that new start location, right?
Oh, okay. So it'll add all the inserts and...
Yep. It'll handle all of that for you. Yeah.
So interesting you mentioned the language service talk tomorrow. So when you were referring to, let's rename and classify variables into as, what did you say?
User type. Yep.
That ties in with language services and so on.
It does.
Is that like a subset, or can you add tags?
I see. So this gets, yes. So in short, every mechanism I showed you here is basically what we're going to use to build up a language service. So you can think of it as pieces of it. Yeah?
This seems like something you could just read an XML file or read a data source for the tags. It seems to lend itself really well to an extension service that you can create the data for. So in other words, if I wanted to put in a to-do item, I could just get a key and it ask me what I wanted and what glyph I wanted.
I see. So what you're saying is, can I actually get information, like create tags without necessarily looking at the spans themselves? Is that what you're...
Well, without having to write the code. I mean, I can write the code once and just have it read from the source file.
I see. So yes, this is possible, right? So what you're doing is you're still tagging spans, but you just don't want to do the work of finding them anymore. You have some other thing that's already done that work, right? There's no reason why you can't just take that same functionality that you've created, right? Take and parse that XML file out, and then add information using these tags in that way. So remember that picture that I showed you, let me see, way, way, way back in the beginning. My whole presentation in 30 seconds. Okay, so remember this picture, right? These green things, I said that information came from somewhere else. Whoops, sorry. That information came from somewhere else. That actually is coming from an XML file. The scenario that was presented here, this is actually the hands-on lab we presented at TechEd this year. And what you were doing is you were creating an editor extension that placed walkthrough steps in a code file, right? And so those walkthrough steps were written out as XML elements, and then we parsed them and did all sorts of fun stuff to create WPF elements out of it, and then just placed them in the thing, inside of the editor as UI. Tags could be done the same way if you wanted.
Originally I thought the green boxes were the comments.
I see.
And how do you identify here and in the XML that green box goes there?
I see. So I cheated a little bit. I knew exactly the location. Since this was a walkthrough, right, I knew the exact location within the original file that I expected to be. And then as you started changing them, I used those tracking spans, right, to make sure that those stayed in the same spot.
Gotcha.
So that's a good example of where you would actually use the tracking spans.
What do you do? You use unique labels in the XML, in the SAML to identify, to associate the two?
No, what is actually happening here, so the way you insert images inside of this, we call these adornments, these UI, these elements that exist just as UI. You have access to the text buffer there, and so what I was basically doing is saying, oh, I want on this line, I want to be associated to this line, I want this image there. We have a bunch of examples of how to do adornments out there. If you go and get the beta 2 and you get the SDK for the beta 2, right? There are templates, 2 of which are dealing with adornment specifically. The text relative adornment will show you exactly how to do something just like that. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, in case nobody else has. On that one picture, what I was thinking is there enough functionality in the designer where you're designing the interface, placing the buttons and all that sort of stuff, so that you can, for example, where the click event happens in your code, can you then show the button that's been clicked and maintain the two so that if you've changed the text of the button in the designer, it automatically shows up inside your code?
Yeah, so in this one, right, this, remember I said that this is actually its own piece of interface, and it's just a WPF interface, right? All of these are buttons, and you're able to click them, and that was all programmed in the XAML. It was not.
I was thinking more about that one, that would show the button that...
So when I click on here?
Yeah, so that if that were a click event, say, that would show the button being clicked as it appears in the design.
Yeah, because that would all be WPF, right? That's all.
Okay.
That functionality all lives inside of WPF. That's not necessarily specific to the editor. All we care about is we put something on our surface. We put a WPF element on our surface. How that WPF element interacts, that's up to you.
And so the WPF for the designer, the form designer.
Sure.
You can track an element on there to the design.cs, the designer.cs code.
Yep. Yep. You can think about it. I mean, realistically, that's just a control. So whatever functionality you program into that control, it's going to still have whenever you drop it inside of the editor. Yeah.
Does the tagger have access to the classification? Like, or is it tag a member based on attributes?
I see. So that's an interesting question. Now, the reason why I say that's an interesting question is the technical answer is yes, because classification under the covers are tags, and so you could get a tag aggregator for classification tags. The reason why I say it's a sort of a difficult question is whether or not you should be mixing that information is where it comes into, right? So classifications are sort of these somewhat more UI concept, right? The idea that you're coloring these things as something. Now with C# and VB, if you're trying to add, like you want to know if something's inside of a comment, that's how you're going to have to do it. And so what you would do is you would create a tag aggregator, right? Look for classification spans that are comments and go about it that way. Yeah.
The classifications and the tags, can they overlap? And
Yeah.
It's not a tree structure or anything.
No. So you can have, so for example.
And what would happen if they overlap when you're trying to do that oranging thing? If you're, for example, doing a for each.
I see.
And you want a for each to be
Sure.
something.
So remember how in Glyph, with the Glyph factory, I said there was an order attribute, right? And that determined whether or not you were above or below, like a breakpoint, for example.
And you do mean
Z index, so literally above or below.
that it would show on the same line, not that it would be hidden by the one on.
No, that it would actually be hidden.
Oh, they would be hidden.
They would be hidden, right? Because
And you don't have any way to expand the margin so that you can.
not in that case, no. So classification also has an order on it. And so what you're able to do, or excuse me, classification formats, which are what determine the coloring and stuff like that. So when we had orange, right, behind the covers, we exported out a classification format that said our to-do type should be orange. And so that has an ordering attribute on it. And what you can do is say, I'm above, for example, the highest priority thing, which means I'm going to be at the very top of the stack. And so I'm going to be orange even if this is a keyword.
Gotcha.
You know, you see what I'm saying? You see what I'm going? So you have the ability to say where you exist inside of that. Should I be more important than somebody else?
If the adornment you put on is transparent, do you still see, like, say I told it be orange, 50% orange.
Mm-hmm.
Will it then show the keyword highlight underneath it, sort of, or does
Well,
it not work?
so they're composable. So if I don't say what color the text should be, all I say is the background should be orange, right? It will compose down and give you the keyword highlight color, but it will take my background color, for example. Any other questions? Yeah.
I don't recall from the sample that you showed.
Sure.
When you were working with XAML for an adorner,
Uh-huh.
what access do you have from the adorner to your text?
I see.
Or to the IDE for that matter?
So the adornment would be something that existed inside of here, right? What we were creating was just a glyph inside of the glyph margin. And so in that case, nothing, because realistically they shouldn't. All they're doing is being associated directly to a tag. Now, when you create an adornment like this one, right? When you're creating something that actually goes inside of that, and if you look at the template that we provide, what you do is you have access to that view. So if remember here I said that the UI is this thing called the view, right? And the view has access to the text buffer, which you could then use to get access to that information. Now, in general, our hope, and so remember I said that it's really important, supply the data if you can. Our hope is that you do all of that, not necessarily where you're writing an adornment, right? But you create a tagger that handles all of that information, and then you just use the tags to figure out where your adornment should go and stuff like that. That's in general what we're looking for. Because again, that opens up for someone else to come in and consume that same information to create other functionality on top. Any other questions? Yeah.
What's the craziest idea for an extension that you or the Visual Studio team has seen?
Well, I actually have some folks here from the team. I'm going to open that question up to them. What's the craziest thing you guys have heard of?
Craziest include comments?
Say what? Instant messaging in the editor, yeah, that's one that I didn't really understand.
Somebody wrote that demo with.
Yeah, it used to work. Where did we demo that at, Sean?
That was an internal one.
Oh, it never went out to anyone? Oh. I thought it went.
Video in the editor.
Yeah, I did video in the editor. That was kind of useless. No, just kidding.
And has anybody tried doing a flowchart and the text editor, so the text shown in the flowchart, when you update it, is really updated in the text?
No, we never did anything like that, no. But actually, you can see that might potentially have some interesting use cases, right? You have a domain-specific language, and you have a designer for it, and you start messing with the designer, and you see the code updating underneath it. Might be interesting.
Can you set filtering on your adornment levels?
Sorry.
In other words, if you're talking about Z order on your,
Sure.
on your adornment levels, is it possible to filter those to say I only want to see level 3 or level 5?
That I don't know. Guys, is that possible? I don't believe it is. Is there a way to turn off adornment layers? No.
You can add, we allow you to add your own and
Like you could imagine writing an extension which, went and looked at a particular adornment layer and removed all the adornments on that layer, but that's a pretty heavy hammer.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's up to the extension provider to offer any kind of config option like turn me on or off or whatever.
Right.
There isn't anything in Visual Studio that says enable or
No.
disable.
And so that's something that's interesting that's come up with our work on a lot of this extensibility stuff is that we can't necessarily, because we've opened it up so much, we can't control necessarily a lot. And so that's one of the points I didn't make it in this talk, but one of the points I would like to stress to you guys: talk to each other. Because you guys are going to be creating all sorts of different things, and they may conflict, right? So the example that we had before where you have a breakpoint over top of it, you're hidden. You could imagine that with something that wasn't already inside VS, another glyph instead of a breakpoint. So these are things you're going to have to work with each other a little bit about, or just hope that nobody installs both of yours.
Question.
Just a second.
Oh, sure.
What about creating a new margin? Seems like the problem with this is you've got one margin.
Sure.
Glyphs are
Sure, yeah, you can do whatever you want. So margins, like I said, were extensions themselves, so you can export out yourself a new margin and start adding information there. Now, if you're doing something that is just like the breakpoint, right, just like a glyph margin, there's not necessarily a good reason to create a new one unless things start getting crazy. But at that point, that's more the user's problem than yours, right, as the extender. They've decided to install 30 extensions that do the same thing. That might not be the right thing to do. All right, anything else? About out of time. Go ahead.
Suppose your margin is 24 pixels,
Mm-hmm.
and you make your icons 12 pixels.
Mm-hmm.
Will the icon placer put the second ones beside?
I believe they overlap. Do you guys know? I know that Amin's really the right person to ask, but he's. If you have two glyphs inside the glyph margin, is there any space negotiation there? They overlap, right? Okay. In the center, right? Yeah. So they would it's still overlap. In that case, but
Yeah. So
if you wanted to, like the guy back there said, you could write your own margin and have it
Well,
space
so you
negotiate and do all sorts of crazy stuff.
ameliorate the hiding by having half-size glyphs.
Right, but that margin, to my knowledge, doesn't ever change size. So it's always that same way.
What?
I believe. Isn't that the case?
Everything is supposed to have a resizable.
All right, any other questions? Is that it? All right, thanks, guys.